Thank you, Ellen, and welcome to all of you, and welcome to Joyce. Lovely to have you all here. There's such a bunch of you, which is just fantastic. The big important thing, of course, is that the cafe is just out there for coffee. I think that's probably more important than the bathrooms. And don't evacuate unnecessarily, which is kind of an interesting idea, isn't it? You could all just get up and decide to rush out all of a sudden. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting here today, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to any Indigenous people here today. I mean that. It's my pleasure to welcome you here. I'm masquerading as Dr. Alex Byrne, who's our state librarian, who can't be here today, but would have been if he could. So as Ellen said, I'm Executive Director of Public Libraries and Engagement, and I have the great privilege of working with the Public Library Services branch in this library who do, I think, sensational work. And I've been able to visit several libraries just in the last few months. I've only been doing this role for a little while, and just in the last few months I've been able to visit some public libraries. So if you would like me to come, I'd like to come as well, because I think what you do is absolutely extraordinary, and I have loved all of my visits, each and every one of them. So apart from the wonderful public library team who work with councils and their libraries statewide, our division also manages exhibitions, events, venue hire, cafe, which is hence my plug for it, library shop, media and communications, government relations, publications and design research, and the Library Foundation. So it's quite a broad group, but having got all together, there's so many points of connection between us all. The division is focused on advancing the library strategy to engage audiences and work with partners to promote libraries, library services, librarians, and collections to the community. I'd particularly like to welcome our partners in today's event, the New South Wales Public Library Readers Advisory Services Working Group. How big is that group? Not all of you. Yeah, thank you. The reason that today's seminar is focused on Westerns and literary fiction is because, apparently, apart from these topics being intrinsically fun and interesting, you asked for them. You provided this information in the evaluation for last year's seminar and indicated that these were the genres you found the most challenging to assist clients with. This seminar will feature with Joyce, who's up there, by video conference, and well done, Ellen. Joyce is a librarian and author whose works include the Reader's Advisory Guide to Genre Fiction and Reader's Advisory Service in the Public Library. Joyce is active in the Adult Reading Roundtable, whose purpose is to develop skills in library staff to assist in advising readers and in promoting reading for pleasure through public libraries. 35 million people visited the public library in New South Wales last year. Is that a stat you know? That's you. That's all down to you guys. Becky Spratford, some of you have heard 2 years ago when she was in-depth exploring horror, was also part of the Adult Reading Roundtable. As well as Joyce, you'll be hearing from many library workers from across New South Wales as you look at One Book, One Community, how comics can be featured as part of the Reader's Advisory Service, and how to evaluate Reader's Advisory Services. We will also run the very popular 10 slides in 5-minute talks, highlighting local developments in Reader's Advisory Services from videos to pop-up libraries. After the seminar, visit our current exhibitions. So upstairs on level 1, we have Family Fragments. Imagine a city, 200 years of public architecture. It doesn't sound very interesting, but actually it is. Celebration Jewish Community Photographs, as well as the Maze Gallery. And the Maze Gallery has some really interesting smaller treasures, if you like, that come from the library's collection. This may give you some ideas to explore for non-fiction readers' advisory work. Today's program will provide you with innovative ideas, information, practical things to take back to your library, and the opportunity to discuss issues that will help you when you return to your libraries. My thanks to Ellen for orchestrating this day, which I know you will enjoy. I'm sorry I can't stay for all of it because I would really like to. But thank you for being here. It is a great pleasure to have you here. And it's a great pleasure for you to be involved with public libraries. So thank you for the opportunity. Ellen.
Thank you very much, Lucy. We'll be handing over to Joyce really soon, but firstly, etiquette of questions for Joyce. If you have a question, you really have to come up here and ask it, because otherwise Joyce can't see you. That's really important, that Joyce can see you with a question. Now, it's fine to ask questions through, she's doing 2 presentations, so it's fine to ask questions, but I know it's really scary to come up here and ask a question, but it really makes a big difference for Joyce to be able to see you. So we'll hand over to Joyce now.
Okay.
So Joyce, you should come up onto the screen once you start talking. Lovely.
Okay.
Thanks,
great.
Joyce.
And you can see my bedroom and my office. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I wish I were actually there. I was there about 4 years ago, I think. But I'm looking forward to coming back sometime because, you know, you see so little of Australia unless you really make a point of staying a long time. I've got a script today, and I will be following it because if I don't, I will just natter on forever and your whole program will be gone for the whole day. So I will be following the script, but do please come up and interrupt me with it. Come up and when you have questions and ask them, or ask them between the two presentations. I'm hoping that you will have questions and things to interact with. I do want to say before I get started that my bias is clearly towards American fiction and the kinds of issues that we face here in the U.S. working with readers. But I think my comments are general enough that you'll be able to extrapolate and see. I'm just wondering, oops, I just lost myself. All right. Is there too much light on my face that you can't see?
No, it's good. I'm just trying to get it so it's not flipping between you and us. I'm sorry, and I'm
okay,
completely
that's fine.
failing on that.
I'm just wanted to be sure that it was because I do have a light up here. I'm hoping that my comments will be universal enough that you'll see how you can apply the ideas that I have to your collections and to working with your readers. Okay, that said, I'm going to start with genres, literary fiction, and we'll see whether I can bring this up as I did before. Run it as a slideshow, and whether you'll still see me, I don't know. I don't see you, Ellen, so if there are questions, you're going to have to say something, maybe. Does that work? Because I don't see anything on my screen except the slides.
We'll get people to come up and ask questions if they need to.
Right, they can just interrupt me because I can't see you on the screens at all. Okay. I'm going to start by putting literary fiction in a bigger box of genres. I think it allows us to help readers better and to understand the appeal of the genre and others that are related. So books that appeal to generally to the intellect are literary fiction, mysteries, psychological suspense, and science fiction. And they're all puzzles of some sort. They may delve deeply into social and ethical issues or relationships, or they may present a more straightforward whodunit. Generally, they raise issues that require readers to consider difficult situations and often to view the world differently. Readers take pleasure in the fact that these books make them think, to ponder situations and problems, or to work out a solution. And many of these are more elegantly written and slower paced, and others move more quickly, but they sustain that appeal. And the tone is usually unsettling in some way, not always dark, but often filled with unexpected twists in character and story. Generally speaking, ideas and characters are more important than tone and action. So these are the opposites in emphasis to the adrenaline genres, and I consider adrenaline genres to be adventure, thriller, suspense, where pace rules. And also they're different from the genres that appeal first to the emotions, general reads, horror, romance, and women's fiction. Those are all about tone, so these are different. Classic titles, ones that have stood the test of time, are an important component of literary fiction and all the intellect genres. And in some genres, tastes change so dramatically that the older titles aren't necessarily as readable today as they once were. In the intellect genres, we can continue to select the classics right along with newer titles. They still hold up. And before I go any further, you have, in addition to seeing the same things on the screen, and you'll have this recording, you also have a handout that has all the information that's on the slides, including the authors and titles of the book jackets that you're going to be seeing. So I'm hoping that means you can relax and just absorb what's useful, and then if you want to, go back and check out some other things. All right, literary fiction, the appeal of literary fiction. As in every genre, there's a wide range of titles that fit here, but all of them meet these appeal criteria. And pride of place for literary fiction, I think, goes to language and style. Literary fiction is critically acclaimed, and it's often award-winning fiction. Literary style is very important. It attention is paid by authors and readers to words and how they are woven together. Elegant, often poetic language is employed. And language is really important to readers and to the writers, who carefully choose every word. The structure of the novel itself may be more complex and even experimental. On the slide, you've got multiple award winners: Brooks, Flanagan, Mantell, and Mitchell. And if books can be gritty and lyrical, I'd say
Excuse me, Joyce.
Uh-huh.
Sorry to interrupt, Joyce. It's not moving through the slides. We're still on the other slide for literary fiction.
Well, that's interesting. You still can't
Just to
see
let
it.
you know.
You still can't see it.
Yep, still can only see your cover slide for literary fiction. We can see the other ones coming up, but only your cover slide.
I don't know what to do. Maybe
Okay.
maybe I'm going to have to go back to that other screen and you'll see them as they come, like this. Can you see that?
Yeah. That's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do it that way. It's not as pretty, but we'll do it that way. Okay. So here, I think I was talking about The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which I think is gritty and lyrical, and what a wonderful book. And I think Haruf's books, which are set in small towns in eastern Colorado, are also lyrical, but written in very spare prose. Stylistically, I think it's hard to beat The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which is told through the point of view of an autistic youth with the chapter numbers all prime numbers, not just 1, 2, 3. And it's a great play too. I don't know if it's come to Australia, but if you get a chance to see it, it is a marvelous theatrical experience. And of course, then there's Cloud Atlas with its stylistic complexity. Literary fiction novels are also character-centered, and the philosophical questions central to these books are often explored more through character than through the story. Characters, even secondary characters, are multidimensional and often act in ways that are unpredictable, which is very satisfying to fans. It's worth noting that characters are not always sympathetic. If you've read The Ecologist, you know what I mean. But there are myriad books that make the same point. Characters are vividly imagined, endlessly intriguing, and not always nice. The same is true in Herman Koch's The Dinner. The covers give you examples of these books that demonstrate their appeal. I particularly want to point out the Last Night of the Lobster. I don't know if that points out that one particularly. It covers the mundane details of a manager's last shift, literally his last shift before this restaurant, which is part of the restaurant chain, Red Lobster, closes for good. It's a touching account of the timeless story of a job and a moment that's lost. It's a poignant and melancholy tale of characters and their relationships. Storylines are provocative in literary fiction, often addressing more serious issues and raising important questions. These are complex, multi-layered, character-centered novels that wrestle with universal dilemmas. They're books for the mind more than for the emotions. And there's not much action in literary fiction, which can be a problem for readers like me who cherish plot. I've put the book of speculation here on this slide for those of us who like a little more story, though it still has the requisite character-centric, thoughtful storyline appeals. If I say it's about a librarian and a mysterious book, I hope I've hooked you with that. Endings in literary fiction are ambiguous. These are titles that automatically come to mind when you're looking for book discussion books. The issues are often unresolved endings make them enormously disgusting. And remember, too, that many of the novelists are also award-winning short story writers, and literary fiction readers are among the biggest fans of short stories in our libraries. I've got one of Alice Munro's collections here, Nobel Prize winner, and I think one of our finest short story writers. Her books and the others here are all popular as book discussion books in my neck of the woods. And then because of those open endings, provocative storylines, but it's also the characters and the languages as well. Everything fits together in all of these genres. Since there's usually not a lot of action in these novels, the pacing is leisurely, stately, graceful. They're more densely written, and the combination of complex storylines and characters, along with imaginative, image-rich language, stylistically rich language, slows the pace. But readers, frankly, don't mind. These are books to savor, not to race through. The ones which one might reread a sentence or a paragraph because the imagery is so rich and the language is so lovely. Even with a book like Room, which seems as if it should be fast and suspenseful because it's the story of a young woman who's kidnapped and held for a number of years. But really the bulk of the story and the tone of the story, it's all about the aftermath. So it's quieter and more psychological based than one would expect. And just skip too many pages down my scripts. Tone. The tone of literary fiction may be bleaker, darker, because of the seriousness of the issues considered. But not always. There's often humor, though sometimes it's black humor. I think there's a range of tone in every genre. Literary fiction is no exception. Books don't have to be serious to be literary. The dark side of literary fiction, I think, are represented by something like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, that cover is the perfect example of this post-apocalyptic America where it is set. And the story of Edgar Sawtelle is another one that's quite dark and somber in tone, I guess, more than actually blue. Now, on the literary side, I think anything Richard Russo writes, Jonathan Safran Foer writes, Patrick DeWitt writes is going to have a lot of humor. Even if they tackle serious issues, they do it with a humorous undercurrent that satisfies a lot of readers. And lastly, frame and setting, the background details that many of us readers cherish in books across the genres. Literary fiction has a lot to offer here as well. These stories are richly descriptive and often have elaborate backgrounds. There's the historical circus that's the setting of Water for Elephants. There are the nurses from Australia in World War I that provide an intriguing look at historical backgrounds and historical battles. And I think just the feel of the times, not to mention those secrets at home. It's one of my favorite books the year that I read it. Year of Wonders offers a strong sense of time and place and also a fairly dark tone. It's not a happy book, but it's lyrical and evocative and very satisfying. And then with Chocolat, of course, there's the chocolate and the magic and the French landscape. So it's a different kind of tone. But geographical settings and background frames enhance these novels and many readers' appreciation of them. Questions about appeal. I like to talk about genres in terms of the different appeal elements because I think it varies. Which one is strongest varies from genre to genre, as you'll see when I talk about Westerns, where I'm going to talk about frame or setting first. Okay, moving on, literary fiction classics. I think literary fiction classics are the classics as we know them and study them. In fact, generally, when we use the term literary classics, this is what we're talking about. So while we've got Homer, whom I also consider a classic in the adventure genre, we've got Dickens and Twain and Hawthorne and George Eliot and Thomas Mann and Leo Tolstoy, Gustave Flaubert, and more modern examples are Virginia Woolf and John Updike, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The list goes on and on. And these are the authors we were assigned in school. Now, you may have been assigned a slightly different list of authors, but I think whatever you were assigned in school for your English classes or your literature classes, these books are somehow much more interesting when we meet them now as adults. And I think that's something to remember when we're working with literary fiction readers. They may be interested in discovering or revisiting classic titles as well as more recent titles that they've heard. I like to talk also about authors that I think are important, authors to know about, so you've got a basis of people to be familiar with when you talk with readers. Now, as I said, my bias is towards the kinds of authors that readers here in the U.S. and in my area of Illinois, in fact, respond to, maybe generally in the U.S. And you're likely going to have others authors. So I hope you will take what I say about these authors and then think about who are the literary authors that your readers are going to be interested in reading, or the acclaimed ones, the award winners, and talk about them in the same, see the same appeal elements in those authors as well. It's extraordinarily hard to come up with just 5 authors to talk about, but if I talk about more, we will, as I say, be here forever. Each of us has a list of favorites, those beautifully written, complex novels that every thinking person should have read and loved. Take the ones that are popular at your library and make your list. This is just a place to start. Now for us, Michael Chabon is a contemporary popular literary author who likes to play in other genres as well. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner for The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, and he explores men's lives and beyond with skillful dialogue, a community of characters, often stalled lives and relationships, and he demonstrates humor mixed with tenderness for his characters. He is a superior genre blender. You might find elements of historical fiction, mystery, science fiction, and more in his sometimes outrageous but always satisfying works. Personally, I would suggest starting with something like Wonder Boys and the film of Wonder Boys, which was quite excellent and true to the book. On the other hand, the award-winning Cavalier and Clay gives you the golden age of comics, Jewish mysticism, and the importance of family. I also threw in my personal favorite, which is Gentlemen of the Road, and maybe because I love historical fiction and I love adventure. And this is just a lovely road adventure. And it's set in 9th century Central Europe, and it stars two hapless swords for hire who fall into a very curious quest. And it's full of adventure and humor and some historical details. It's short. It's just one of those delightful gems that I love to come across and then share. Ian McEwan is my second author to know, and he's won the Booker National Book Critics Circle Awards, among others. His are exquisitely crafted, distinctly unsettling novels, and they're often book discussion titles. His earlier work is quite dark and maybe not to be suggested with abandon for those like me who really like Saturday. In fact, that's really the essence of a literary fiction writer. Each book is usually very different. So readers who read every book by an author, which literary fiction readers tend to do, will get the same author, but often a very different experience with every book that they read. And I think that's one of the things that they cherish. McEwan often covers large issues, as in World War II and atonement, but he considers them on a very small and personal scale. His stories are rich in social satire. In the booklist review of Saturday, Donna Seaman writes, McEwan's key strategy is to pit reason against chaos and art against arbitrariness as he orchestrates thorny moral dilemmas and menacing situations. I'd start there. It's about a neurosurgeon's brush with outside violence. Toni Morrison charts the lives of African American women, past and present. However, her books resonate with readers of all races. Her literary style and technique reinforce the universal nature of these insightful stories. She is a national treasure. She's a major award winner, including the Nobel Prize, and while we think of her as writing literary fiction because she attacks serious issues with difficult dilemmas and seductive lyrical prose, she's also an Oprah favorite, which has pretty much institutionalized her here as an accessible author of note. Sula was an Oprah Book Club choice, and it makes a good introduction to her character-centered fiction. But Beloved, I think, remains her classic. For a change of pace, Haruki Murakami employs spare lyrical prose to create a dreamy mood and a haunting atmosphere. Jazz motifs frequently play prominent roles as in After Dark. Daniel Handler, who's probably better known as children's author Lemony Snicket, is a vocal champion of Murakami's, and he once wrote a review which is really a paean to the author in The Village Voice, and he called it, I Love Murakami. Haruki Murakami is our greatest living practitioner of fiction, he wrote. The novels aren't afraid to pull tricks, usually banned from serious fiction. They are suspenseful, corny, spooky, and hilarious. They're airplane reading. But when you're through, you spend the rest of the flight, the rest of the month, rethinking life. Traits that mark Murakami's novels are a solitary male protagonist who drifts just outside society, first-person narration, and philosophical passages nestled within outlandish, unconventional plots. When I talk about Running, which is pictured there as well, is his memoir. And lastly, Zadie Smith. She represents the younger face of literary fiction, sometimes brash and stylishly extravagant. She's a phenom, of course, having written her first novel, White Teeth, while she was still at Cambridge. Fans love her complex and sprawling storylines and her biting satire. Her books are studies in contrast. They're written in lyrical prose, but the writing is also humorous, witty, and often satirical, and her books feature vividly drawn characters. They're refreshing, controversial, provocative, outrageous even. Her books, fiction and nonfiction, are both entertaining and challenging. So questions about any of the people, authors, or things generalizations I've made about them, after saying that every time they write a different book. It's really hard to make generalizations about literary fiction readers beyond just kind of those basics. Okay, I'm going to move on then to more names to know. I guess I should have waited till I did this slide. There's so many wonderful literary fiction authors that offer you a wide range of appeals, and I've given you some additional authors, and they're listed on your handout, of course. They represent my despair here. There's no time to talk about Joyce Carol Oates and Thomas Pynchon and Jonathan Safran Foer and Shirley Hazard, among others. So, you know, there are a lot of wonderful authors out there to know. Now, I want to talk about crossover, and I like to talk about crossover when I talk about genres, because I like to talk about the reach of a genre and the way it blends with others and how we can help readers back and forth between genres because of appeal. I don't know if you'll be surprised to hear that there's a lot of crossover with literary fiction. Literary fiction writers that might appeal to other genre readers, certainly. That's kind of a no-brainer. I think the harder problem is introducing your literary fiction readers to genre writers who will meet their expectations for well-crafted novels. Authors like P.D. James and James Lee Burke in mystery, or Ruth Rendell in psychological suspense, or Neil Stevenson in science fiction. And then with almost everything else in the few examples that I've given you here. Each of these represents the literary end of another fiction genre. Authors who write in a genre, but also write so beautifully and often provocatively that they're good suggestions for literary fiction readers. There's nonfiction crossover as well. History, memoir, biography, science, travel, you name it, there's going to be crossover. And I think in part because literary fiction readers are often adventurous, and when they read a novel, they may be intrigued by the background in the novel, and they want to know more. They want to know more about the history of an area or a person, or more about a sense of the place that was being written about. Their chief criterion is that the writing style be up to their standards. So nonfiction is also a good bet. And I encourage you, when you work with literary fiction readers, to throw in some nonfiction suggestions as well, because they're often very pleased. There is, of course, a range of, well, not so much writing styles, because the ones that I'm talking about really are of the more elegantly written edge. I try not to say well written, because I think that phrase doesn't really mean much to readers, because whoever we love writes well, but they write elegantly. They're stylistically complex. And so with science, for example, the writing's going to vary from Bill Bryson's kind of lighthearted approach to science to Davis Sobel's very accessible approach to science, to someone like Brian Greene, who is just way too literary and scientific for my brain, but appeals to a lot of readers. So watch for these and share these with your fans. Okay, trends. Let's talk about trends in literary fiction. This may be a no-brainer for you guys, but for us, we're seeing more and more international writers in the United States, and they're appreciated more and more by readers here, and I think around the world. At long last, we're seeing more international writers published here. You know, it seems for a long time in a lot of areas we were just seeing, you know, mostly US and some UK and some Canadian, and that was about it. But that's changed absolutely. You likely have even more writers available to you in Australia. And I've got two slides here. First, they're popular writers who write in English but aren't American. Again, you see my bias, but I'm building on what I know. And when you look to international writers, you're going to make a different kind of list. But these are ones that we would consider international writers who are extraordinarily popular with readers here. And then the second slide is international writers who write in translation. And that's a tricky issue, as the translator has to be excellent, has to sell the book as well in some ways. And some here you might not have even realized were translations. I forget sometimes. I get swept up in the prose that so skillfully matches the original. Or at least I hope so. I hope the translators are as good as the material that they're working with. But I think in a lot of cases, publishers are pretty careful. Another trend is that classics are being reissued, and purchasing these new editions is a great way to refresh the collection, make it more inviting for readers, and they're far better than those dusty, rebound hardcover editions. As audio and graphic novels, these books are reaching a whole new audience. I've got Kafka's The Trial here, which is an adaptation into graphic novel, and Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now from Naxos on audio. As a fan of audiobooks and 19th century novels, I can attest to the fact that a well-read audio can bring classics to life for a wide range of listeners. We're also going through a lovely time when we're seeing classics adapted for the big screen and small. Masterpiece Theatre, of course, from the BBC, is a long-running venue for classics and productions that draw readers back to the books because they're so inviting. But in the movies, too, my movie suggestion for today is Alice Munro's The Bear Came Over the Mountain, which was a short story and made into the film Away From Her. Now, it came out in 2006, so it's a little bit older, but one of those that's just stayed with me since I saw it. Stars Julie Christie as a 60-something woman with Alzheimer's, and it's beautifully acted and filmed. It's just haunting. And then, of course, you buy the paperback, and the paperback edition comes with a movie cover, which attracts even more readers to it. And I'm also going to mention Bride and Prejudice here. It's an updated Bollywood version of the beloved classic, and I also own Bride and Prejudice as a video. It's absolutely delightful if you haven't seen it. Okay, still with adaptations and retellings, lots of classics are being retold, and the retellings often falls in literary fiction genre as well. And with luck, they lead readers back to the original story, and they spur discussion about the skill of the authors, classic and modern, and how the stories are changed yet remain universal. Jane Steele is the retelling of Jane Eyre, coming out very soon. Maybe you have it already. I can't remember. Where Lindsay Fay's from, or where you might get that. March, of course, is the story of the March family from Little Women, or a continuation of that story. The Weissmans of Westport is a retelling of Sense and Sensibility. John Clinch's Finn is the story of Huckleberry Finn's father. And Independence of Miss Mary Bennet is a sequel to Pride and Prejudice. All of them just delightful, but interesting in the kind of way that I think sends you back to the original. As I've said, these books are a great source of book discussion titles. They're provocative, they're meant to raise issues, they're filled with intriguing characters, and there are myriad sources of great book discussion titles, and lots of questions on the internet, from popular bestsellers across genres to classics and nonfiction, and these are just a few examples. Life is so much easier than when in 1977 I was a new hire at the public library, and my head of adult services wanted me to start a book discussion, and there weren't as many resources then. I've given you some resources here, and I'm just going to nod to them because there's so many available that are free on the internet. These are ones that we use, and you may also follow them or find them of value. There are endless reviews out there, and lists and blogs and bestsellers and best lists. For us, though, one thing I will mention is that the New Yorker magazine is a great source of up-and-coming literary fiction authors, and we watch for their short pieces that often appear there first before they come out with an actual book. And you may have a similar resource, and I would encourage you to share that with each other today so that you know a good way to keep tabs on what's happening and what's coming in the genre. I've also included a list of awards, the tip of the iceberg. You'll recognize these. You likely keep your own list of awards that your readers like to have those books. You'll have a lot of others. Let me say a few last words about literary fiction readers, about the fans. They tend to follow awards, which is one of the reasons why I listed them there. And they like the serious ones, like the Nobel and the Man Booker and the Pulitzer. Not the genre awards so much, unless we identify award-winning genre writers that meet their criterion. And my experience is that these readers especially will read all of an author, as I said, and they're adventurous and willing to try other authors that offer what they like. Character-centered, provocative, even experimental fiction with a complex style and meeting a certain standard of writing. They may read in the genre, but they may not like to think of themselves as genre readers. And they'd probably be appalled to know that we were here today talking about literary fiction as a genre. But what they're really looking for are intriguing, well-written books. And I think we know, because we know our collections, that there are a lot of things out there that might appeal to them. And those are my comments on literary fiction. And I'm going to get out of this and see if I can take some questions, having nattered on for quite a time. I've struck everyone dumb. I don't think that's a good sign, guys. Who are the most popular literary fiction writers that your readers are reading?
Hello, Joyce. It's really nice to meet you. A lot of the authors that you spoke about are authors that we all know and are well read here. Some Australian authors that didn't come up. Tim Winton is probably our most loved Australian literary author. But of course, oh, good. But you had, you know, Richard Flanagan, Kate Grenville, lots of our really loved authors are up there. I would agree with what you say, though. We probably are lucky to have more access to some more international authors than perhaps you get in the States. But I think that most of the books you showed were ones that we're familiar with. Would that be right? Yeah, thank you. That was fantastic. And I personally found it really interesting aligning literary as a genre with science fiction and with mysteries, because you're right, of course, they are novels of ideas. And I've not thought about it like that before, so I found that really fascinating.
Good.
Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else? If not, oh, someone come in? Or am I hearing feedback to your own voice?
Maybe just move on, Joyce, because obviously we've got extremely timid people in the room, which we're the first time, I have to say. So maybe by the time it gets to questions for Westerns, it will be easy for people to come forward.
Yeah, maybe people come forward. Okay, let me see if I can. I've lost my screen share. Let's see what this does. There, can you see that? No. Shoot. This is going to be our day of no technical. Okay, it says screen share. But let me see if I bring this down. Now did it show? No.
I have it on the desktop, so if we have to, I can do what I did for Becky, which is get it up and you can talk me through it.
Okay.
I'll just get Wes on the screen.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, technology is such a such a tricky thing. When I travel to do presentations, I always take 2 or 3 flash drives just in case.
Okay, well, I've got you minimized at present, so we can only see the presentation. So just go next screen. Currently, I'm on the cover slide.
Okay, you can go to the next one, because we're going to do something completely different now with Westerns. And I'm going to place Westerns in the bigger scheme of fiction genres in a bigger box, as I did with literary fiction. I consider Westerns, along with fantasy and historical fiction, landscape genres. It's the world building and the atmosphere and the details that set the stage. These books create a special environment, a world in which the action takes place, and that world has a strong effect on the story and the novel. These genres place a similar emphasis on creating a strong sense of place, whether real or imaginary. Fantasy, historical fiction, and westerns are all set against an intricately described background, and the landscape and background details are crucial. Fantasy creates another world, one in which magic thrives, despite possible similarities to our own known world. And in historical fiction, details of another time must be plentiful and accurate, or the book becomes romance or adventure or something else. Creating a story within a particular time and place is the key to good historical fiction. And westerns also recreate a particular time and place. Details are important, and readers demand that they ring true. History is less important, even though there's a general time period in which they're set. Whether the Western landscape is conveyed through the feel of the wide open prairies or the trails of the pioneers, the landscape and background details are crucial to the success of the story. Interestingly, although some of these, historical fiction especially, are tied to particular specific times, characters, and events, they're also timeless in a sense, or I think the appeal is timeless. They aren't dependent on what happened today and what will happen tomorrow. They're set in times that are frozen, or with fantasy perhaps even outside of time. Look for that timeless appeal and remember that these, like as literary fiction, don't date as quickly as titles in lots of other genres. The classic holds up for years, generations even. And you need to keep popular authors and titles because they'll be read and reread and even republished. And the goal of landscape books is to take us there, to create worlds and set us as readers in them. Both frame and mood become essential in the setting of these authentic, believable worlds. Okay, next slide. On to westerns. These are not the most popular collection at most U.S. libraries, perhaps not at yours either, but I personally love westerns. It might be because I grew up in the wheat country of Kansas and know the pleasures of the great outdoors firsthand. Or perhaps I just relate to the stories. In any case, I think there are at least 3 reasons why it's useful to have some familiarity with this genre and to keep the books available. First, I think westerns are a good entry point into historical fiction for some readers, and from historical fiction to westerns for others. In U.S. fiction, there's a great deal of confusion between historical fiction set in the West, or novels of the westward expansion, and many genre westerns. And I'm not going to try to sort these out title by title. Looking over some of the titles, your Western titles, I think you face the same problem in Australia. Be aware that there's a lot of crossover between these genres, historical fiction and westerns, because genre boxes aren't discrete. Secondly, I think you miss some great reading if you ignore this genre. Lots of history, often adventure, survival, sometimes even a good love story. So have a taste, if only to diversify your own reading. And thirdly, there's so much a part of the country's past, both in Australia and in the US. For us, they're like the Civil War books, one of the most fertile grounds for fiction and nonfiction, and I think there will always be a market for, and always there will be avid readers of the genre. Okay, next slide. What are westerns? This is one of those times when I despair of publishers and how they've made our job so much more difficult. You used to be able to tell a western by the size and shape of the book, about 180 pages and not really very tall either. It was the same thing was true of mysteries, for example. But think about Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove, a huge book, about 900 pages, but a western complete with cowboys and a cattle drive. You may recognize differences in your westerns, but I'm guessing you're going to see some similar elements too. In westerns, traditionally, we expect cowboys, cattle drives, gunslingers, adventure, and gunplay. Westerns feature more romanticized representations of the West and the problems faced there than we find in historical fiction. We get a feel of the Old West, not necessarily lots of historical detail. The time period for U.S. westerns is pretty short. It's from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the beginning of the 20th century. But you'll see that's more of a guideline than a rule. That's the time of the greatest Western expansion, up until the growing technology of the modern era when cars replaced horses. Readers aren't as concerned about the dates, exactly when the book is set, but they do expect accurate details in terms of guns and gunplay and all the trappings of a Western adventure. Westerns then feature the adventures of cowboys, scouts, Native Americans, settlers, and lawmen, and they explore the clash between civilization and anarchy in mythic stories of men and the land. While they may accurately depict the time and place in which they're set, the image and feel of the West and of those times, as well as the struggle to survive against myriad perils, takes precedence over history. Westerns speak to basic, deep-seated feelings about the land and the men who brought justice to the wild, uninhabited country, and thus helped make it safe for those who civilized it. Sounds like your Westerns too, I hope. Okay, on to the appeal of Westerns in the next slide. Why readers are drawn to them. Well, I think, as I suggested earlier, Westerns are about landscape, and the setting plays the most important role. It's often so carefully drawn that it's a character itself. Westerns take readers back to a time and place in which life is set against a dangerous but beautiful backdrop. Landscapes are carefully described. It's the openness and the infinite possibilities this virgin landscape offers that set the tone for these stories. Nature is larger than life, and to survive in this kind of landscape, the men here also have to be bigger than life. But the Western landscape is also a paradox. While it's often lyrically and evocatively described, it may also be painted as barren, treacherous terrain, where survival may be difficult for both men and animals. The landscape is more rugged, more merciless, yet more open to possibilities than the confined landscapes of cities or civilized areas. For those who can survive in the landscape, the Western offers limitless possibilities, as well as transforming powers. Note the covers on the books there. They're mostly brown, rather desolate, and potentially dangerous. They give a sense of the story within, the lone man against the elements. And also, of course, note how large the author's name is. Really, publishers are selling authors, not so much the genre. It's something else for us to remember. Okay, next slide. Talk about the Western hero here. The typical Western hero is a loner who rides into town to clean things up and then rides out again. In traditional Westerns, he's a mythic figure, while in more recent titles, he may be portrayed more realistically. We'll see more of that later on. But you likely noticed in the last slide that all these covers feature a lone man on horseback, and that's the image many have of Western heroes. Characters in Western novels are often based on historical figures, and that ups the ante on the degree of accuracy. Fictional characters can be more mythical, although fiction and books, television, and movies have done a lot to up the ante on people like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Billy the Kid, Ned Kelly. They're a lot more mythical now than they were in real life. I think women play a very interesting role in Westerns, and traditionally they're the women of the night or women in danger. Only occasionally are they wives and mothers. More recently, we see more women writing Westerns or novels set in the West, and we find more interesting characters. Joanne Mapson's books are a good example, and Hearts of Horses, which is pictured here, is a personal favorite, and too literary probably to be considered a Western by some, but it's set in Oregon during World War II when all the men were off to war or too old or too young to go, and it was a time when there wasn't even electricity in that part of Oregon. And it stars a young woman who gentles horses. It's a perfectly lovely, satisfying read. And frankly, with A Town Like Alice, it's a book that I have bought extra copies of to share with friends and house guests because, you know, you loan those two books out and you never see them again. Okay, one last thing about characters. True to its pulp fiction roots, characters may be portrayed stereotypically, good versus bad. And that's changing too, as you know, with more flawed heroes and sometimes even villains who succumb to the redemptive powers of the West. Okay, next slide. We'll talk about the storylines. The plots may be straightforward or complex and involved, but they place our hero in the midst of a morality play. He brings justice and restores order to the community. Of your book covers here, Riders of the Purple Sage with the mysterious Lassiter represents this theme, and Shane is another example, and you'll know more, I'm sure. Many themes are played out in these harsh landscapes. Survival, not to mention revenge and a desire for justice, is represented by Revenant in both book and movie forms. Leif Enger's Peace Like a River speaks to the redemptive power of the West, the place where men and sometimes women go for a second chance. Many, many Western titles deal with revenge. And here's the classic Deathstreak Rides Again, still readable, and the classic movie with Jimmy Stewart and Marlene Dietrich, which while slightly altered from the book, still holds up. The last of the themes is coming of age, and Night Hawk is about, among other things, the coming of age of a young man who's running from the law. Pacing is next, and that's the next slide. And it's not necessarily fast, although books with a strong adventure element and action do move quickly, but there's always a sense of forward movement in these books. They're more like mysteries, I think, in that regard. There's a range of pace in these covers. The first of Louis L'Amour's Sackett books offers its share of adventures, but here description slows the pace a bit as his series family travels from England to the United States. And while I wouldn't call Ombre exactly fast-paced, the building of tension as the stagecoach is attacked and all fear death leaves the readers breathless. It's riveting and compelling, and there's description, but the spare prose also speeds the pace here. Language and style is the next slide. Language is colorful but spare. Cowboys are not known for their loquaciousness, yet there are often lovely landscape and setting descriptions. Jargon plays a major role in the dialogue, in True Grit and both movie versions, and also in Little Big Men, both the book and movie as well. There are also stylistic variations. Many stories, especially those that overlap with historical fiction, are told as diaries or as in letter form, as in These Is My Words. And you likely know better than I about Western poetry with The Man from Snowy River, though that was surely made more famous worldwide in the movie versions. What a surprise to see that there was actually a movie version in 1920. For those of us in North America, there are memorable poems of Robert Service, writing about another Western landscape, this time in Canada. And tone is the next slide. And tone is also important, and these books tend to be nostalgic, looking back to times past. There's a wide range of tone, and to provide contrast, I tried to think of the darkest Western I knew, and that's got to be by Cormac McCarthy. And here I've got Blood Meridian for you. But there's humor in Westerns too, as represented by the McMurtry title and also the novelization of Seth MacFarlane's A Million Ways to Die in the West. I think there are a number of better humorous Western movies, Cat Ballou, The Blazing Saddles, for instance, but humor works well, even in this genre. I think to get a good sense of the tone of many Westerns, listen to a few mournful cowboy songs. Red River Valley, Streets of Laredo, Old Paint, to name a few. They're all on YouTube. These melancholy melodies, along with the lyrics that speak to past hard times and an uncertain future, have shaped our sense of the genre in the pages of books, as well as through radio, TV, and the movies. These songs and stories form an integral part of our popular culture and consciousness, and they celebrate the past. Hard times are the norm in Westerns, but they are also the best hard times. Classic authors is the next slide, and I've got 3 sure bets, although they're all dead, and I frankly believe living authors make much better sure bets. But in Westerns, I think that doesn't matter quite so much. Western writers don't write from the grave, as some authors tend to, but their books are so popular that they're continually reprinted. Louis L'Amour lives on in reprints of his classic tales and standalone and series. And Elmer Kelton, who's on this slide, I hope, likely will as well. Kelton may not be as familiar with his character-centered, historically accurate novel set in his native Texas. His stories rely less on action and more on characters placed in realistic, believable settings, but they are absolutely wonderful reads. And the next slide is Louis L'Amour. He's the Congressional Gold Medal and Presidential Medal of Freedom winner, so a big deal in the U.S. He's the one, though, who is a bigger deal, I think, because he revived the Western genre with his action-packed stories of adventure and survival, peopled with strong heroes fighting for justice and making a way for civilization. Publishers are reprinting his books, and they're also putting them on audio. And if you can get them, the books read by David Strathairn are just sublime in audio. And the last of these 3 slides is Ivan Doig. He just died recently, and so I've had to move him as a classic sure bet author. His books are set mostly in the 20th century West, with a few forays into earlier times, and they feature homesteaders rather than cowboys and offer a more realistic look at the West. Not gunplay, but cattle herding and the history of Western Montana. Lyrical writing, a sense of place, love of the land place him firmly, though, with the traditional Western. Try The Whistling Season. It explores Montana's storied past and one-room schoolhouses. The nostalgic tone will resonate with lots of readers, I think, as it does here. The next slide is going to give you a few more classic authors because there are way too many to talk about everyone. I do want to highlight Robert B. Parker, who's certainly much better, now dead unfortunately, and certainly much better as a mystery writer. But his Cole and Hitch series, which are Westerns, is enormously popular, and it's likely going to live in reprints for generations. And what's more, new authors are taking on the series, and so we're getting more additions to that series. Their books are well-researched, richly described, delightful Westerns. The Westerns is a genre that has had a number of unexpected unexpected authors who have dabbled very successfully in it and just have maybe one Western or two, but they're really good ones. Okay, the next slide gets us into authors that are good authors to know about and maybe have in your collections. Johnny D. Boggs is a prolific award-winning author of fast-paced, adventure-filled Westerns, but he still manages to create vividly drawn characters, and he transforms seemingly ordinary plot lines into compelling and poignant dramas. Many of his stories feature Native Americans in a favorable light, his Kill Straight series in particular, and they deal with soldiers and the aftermath of the Civil War. He even has one about Buffalo Soldiers, who were the black soldiers who fought in the Civil War. His unusual settings will appeal to many readers, as will his sometimes quirky humor. Try Northfield, which is a tale of Jesse James and the James and Younger gangs robbing of a Minnesota bank. The next slide takes us to Loren D. Estelman. And he's known as much for his mysteries, the Amos Walker series in Detroit, as he is for his Westerns. But I think this demonstrates the really close connection between the Western hero and the modern PI, each with a code of ethics that drives actions. Each works independently for justice. It works for justice outside the law, often independently of the law, and each is a loner. So it's really good link for readers between the two genres, mysteries and Westerns. He writes single-title Westerns about Western figures: Wild Bill Hitchcock, Buffalo Bill Cody, Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp, and then he's got a fictional series featuring a Western detective, Paige Murdoch. Solid research, writing about cut above the genre make his books a good suggestion for a range of readers. They're darker, perhaps, and gritty, perhaps even noir, but there are lots of details of the Western landscape, external and internal. And the next slide is Joe Lansdale. He is a Texas author of both mysteries and Westerns, not to mention horror. And no matter the genre, he writes dark and often quirky stories, perhaps not for our fans of traditional Westerns, but maybe a good bet to introduce readers who aren't fans to the pleasures of the genre. His stories are fast-paced and filled with adventure, and his characters are well-drawn, and his prose is witty. Paradise Sky is a kind of fictional memoir. It's the real story of Deadwood Dick, who's the hero of many a pulp Western. Over the years, Larry McMurtry is the next slide. And over the years, I've written and spoken about Westerns, and I've fussed back and forth about whether to use McMurtry as one of my 5 top authors. Sure, he writes Westerns, but he also writes historical fiction and literary fiction and wonderful nonfiction. And I finally decided that he probably wouldn't mind being put here, since it's the Western landscape that dominates his books. He's known for de-romanticizing the West. And if you're familiar with Lonesome Dove and Along on That Cattle Drive, you know exactly what I mean. It was dangerous and dirty, and frankly, not everyone had a good time. But McMurtry's West also features vivid characters, male and female, and his rich descriptions evoke a strong sense of time and place. He writes sweeping cinematic tales in lyrical prose, and they often project that melancholy tone. Although the Barry Bender series and Telegraph Days, which is pictured here, are decidedly amusing. He also writes excellently readable nonfiction accounts of the West, so he's another good crossover author to suggest, or if you suggest him, don't forget his nonfiction as well. And the last slide is Richard S. Wheeler, who writes more novels of the West, so he's crossover with historical fiction readers. He has multiple series. He has A Newspaper Man, Sam Flint, a Rocky Mountain Trapper and Frontiersman, Barnaby Sky, as well as novels about individuals associated with the West, Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp, for example. And in these, he goes behind the myth to explore the real man. His books are character-centered with richly detailed settings, and they're just good stories. Okay, the next slide, I'll start talking about the genre blending and crossover. The overlap with historical fiction, as I suggested, is really the main overlap. The stories of fictional and real characters and places, of mountain men and settlers, of hardships and successes, of strong men and women settled the West. And on this slide, you'll see more women represented as well. And on your handout, you'll get all those authors and titles. If we move to the next slide, it takes us to a wider range of areas where there's crossover. Mystery and romance, particularly popular, inspirational titles as well. So here I've got representatives of 6 genres. For mysteries, I've got the Hawkins Smith, I think, I can't read my writing, series. For romance, Linda Leal Miller. For inspirational, Stephen Bly. For fantasy, Emma Bull. For horror, another Joe Lansdale title. But I think science fiction is a particularly good match for Westerns, like historical fiction, I guess. It's that unexplored frontier, the dangerous but beautiful landscape, the possibility of aliens or aborigines. The Empress of Mars is a lovely romp. It's the Old West set on Mars and complete with outlaws and even a barroom. And then there's Your Firefly, which I haven't seen, but the poster looks like a perfect match. I think it's no surprise that horse operas can be as popular as space operas. The next slide will take you to what I consider to be the ultimate genre blend, which is Patrick DeWitt's Sisters Brothers, which may breathe new life into the Western genre. It's along the lines of the Coen Brothers movie version of True Grit. And I think this is perfect Coen Brothers material, but it's been optioned by John C. Reilly, whom I can also see as a younger, less violent of this pair of assassins who are loosed in the wilds of California to murder a man with a gold claim. It's got black humor, a real sense of time and place, and ruthless killers. It's got a great cover, too, that I think suggests everything. It's for fans of Western, literary fiction. It was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, historical fiction, crime thrillers. Really, what else could you need in a book? I think it's nearly perfect. Okay, the next slide gets us onto trends. And my first trend is the modern Western. Many of the traditional Western tropes are now being played out in a modern setting, with heroes often facing modern problems, but the bones of the genre are still there. And as you'll see in some of the first 2 titles that I'm going to talk about, there are also mysteries. So again, it's that relationship between the private investigator or the mystery character and the Western hero. Michael McGarrity features a modern-day cowboy of sorts. He's an urban policeman who's retired due to injury, and now he helps others find justice from his New Mexico ranch. A real sense of place and a Western hero, but it's set in the wrong time and also in the mystery genre, but many of the same appeals. C.J. Box writes about a Wyoming game warden named Joe Pickett. There's lots of landscape here and danger, and again, a heroic lawman, so a real feel of those Western adventures. Unfortunately for Joe, he's kind of a bad shot, so that adds an extra element to the appeal of those stories. Joanne Mapson views the West from the contemporary female point of view, and Leif Enger is here because of again, that mystical regenerative nature of the West, a place to flee to, a place to get a new start, and this is a coming-of-age story set in the 1950s, but has a real feel of the Western. The next slide will show us reprints of classic Westerns and older stories, and these are everywhere. Don't forget movie versions as well as audiobooks and old radio shows and old TV shows, and think about whole collection with titles from nonfiction as well. I've included the poster from Tarantino's most recent film, which is certainly another kind of Western, and Stephen King's Gunslinger, which is coming to the big screen with a film version of his dark fantasy Western, The Dark Tower, and that's due out in 2017. So again, some genre crossing here. Finally, the next slide is adult Westerns, which isn't a new trend, but pervasive, I guess. These are sexier and more violent, sometimes written by a syndicate, like the old Nancy Drew and Hardy Boy mysteries. And you can often tell by the covers that they are adult Westerns rather than the regular Westerns. But I've given you a few examples. Basically, there's more explicit sex and violence, and that's what distinguishes them. Okay, quickly on to web resources then, which is the next slide. It probably won't come as a surprise that there aren't a lot of web resources for Westerns. Somehow internet and Westerns don't seem like a very good fit, but there are resources worth checking out, and you likely have your own. I have to say, I tried to look for some, and I kept coming up with Western Australia, not Westerns in Australia. So I guess I'm not a very proficient searcher, but I've given you some, and on the handouts you've got the URLs for these. So if you're interested in any of them, you can have a look. And there are also Western awards, and that's the next slide. And these are just a few examples. I'm not sure whether you have an award for your Westerns in Australia or whether it's kind of tucked into some other awards that you give. But again, on the URL, you can find links to these awards, and that may give you some more titles that would be of interest to you. Okay, now for the last slide, and the moment that you've all been waiting for. It's the confluence of Westerns and literary fiction. I was frankly surprised at how many titles I could come up with, and really quickly. You'll undoubtedly have others that you've thought of. I'm not sure some of our literary readers would like to know that they've read Westerns. There is a bit of a stigma about the writing style of this genre, but we know, and we can celebrate the range of titles and highlight those that are truly literary in every sense. And if you guys get Booklist magazine, you'll see that my column for April 1 is about Westerns, and particularly about literary Westerns, and also a mention to preparing this presentation for you guys. There are authors here that I mentioned already today: McMurtry, Doig, McCarthy, but others as well. Peter Carey's book on Ned Kelly, which I just loved. Annie Proulx's Wyoming Stories, one of which was made into the movie Brokeback Mountain, which is a very modern Western. Mary Doria's Russell's Epitaph, which was preceded by Doc and documents the life of Doc Holliday. Philip Meyer's Texas Saga, The Sun, and Lynn Enger, who is the brother of Leif, and his book The High Divide, which is kind of a saga, a Western saga. There are so many good stories in this genre, and I hope you find some to share with your readers. And I hope you'll email me with suggestions of Westerns that I should be reading, because I'm always looking for more. And luckily for all of us, that's all I have to say, and I'm ready for questions or anything else you want to share.
Thank you very much, Joyce. I'm just getting you back on the screen so we can see you. Okay. I really enjoyed that. I have a question while somebody else thinks of a question to come up and join me. Actually, although mine's more a comment, I was noticing that the more recent Brandon Sandersons, the Mistborn ones, they are a strong fantasy Western combination. And there was a steampunk one, which the name escapes me at present, had the best Western train robbery on it. Yes. And it was set in this steampunk universe. And it was kind of like, it was the highlight of the book, but it was brilliant in this steampunk Western combination.
I'm making a note because you're absolutely right.
Look up the details of the steam. It will be on my Goodreads account, so I'll be able to track it that way. Okay, good.
You know, Westerns are really everywhere. As long as you're looking for those elements, you can find them in lots of books. And I don't know about your Western readers, but a lot of ours are kind of dying out, and I hate to think that the genre is going to die out too. And I'm glad to see these themes being reinvigorated in other genres. I think it's a very good sign. And also a sign of how classic these stories are and how important they are. So.
Yeah. Now, I noticed a question come through on Twitter about shelving Westerns. Does that person, and I know you're in the room, want to come forward and ask it? It seem to be phased around shelving of Westerns. In the US, they shelved separately or integrated. I know it's the...
It's the first question. I think you will find it both ways. I think in areas where there's a strong audience, where there are a lot of readers, or where you think they're good, that you have a lot of fans of the Western genre, you're going to have a separate collection. And I think when that happens, it's much better used. But I would encourage you, if you don't have a separate Western, to think about putting them out on displays, on any, on your general just good books displays, or having regular Western displays, because I think you might be surprised at the response that you get. So how's that for a waffle?
Joyce, thank you for the presentation. It was really good. I just wanted to ask a question about shelving. A while back, we'd always had Westerns shelved separately because people specifically want to come and just find those with the spine, obviously, genre sticker. And then what happened was someone decided to put all of the Westerns back into general fiction. So this caused quite a problem. And quite a lot of our Western readers that we didn't know before fronted up and said, where are they? And, and were very, they found it particularly difficult to find them. So we relented and went back to a separate collection for Westerns. And I just wanted to know, is there many libraries that do have a separate Western collection? And do they do displays? Because that was another question. They tend to get left out of displays quite a bit.
Yeah, I think and I'm glad for you that you have a Western collection again. Lucky you. Ours was disbanded because of space considerations when they had to, and also when they. I don't want to go into that. After I left, they withdrew like a big chunk of the fictions collection, and it just hurts me to think of the books that I love that are gone. But anyway, I think having a Western collection, if you have an audience of Western readers, is great. But boy, I would encourage you to make an effort to include these just in the range of things that you make available to your readers. Because as you discovered when you got rid of the collection, you probably have fans that you've never talked to because they're self-sufficient. And this way it introduces a whole new group of people to the pleasures of Westerns, which I think are many. So I think it's invaluable to have them out there. I think if you have book lists on your webpage, for example, you should be sure to have Westerns, or if you have, like our library has a rotating series of book jackets, throw some Western book jackets on there as well, because they're extraordinarily they portray exactly what happens in the book, and I think they're very inviting. So I think you're doing all the right things, and I would encourage everyone to think about it as a mission to, every genre, to be sure to give every genre a play, but Westerns especially, they're often neglected.
Well, they fell into the category of our Read, Watch, Play themes for this year, because in January we did Wild Reads, and we were able to extend that to our Western collection, which was really good. So, that was another way of getting people that appeal characteristic with other genres, because it's not specific to a genre. So,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay, I'll finish.
Yeah, I'm hoping your graphic novel person this afternoon is going to talk about Westerns and graphic novels, because I'm pretty sure there probably are some. But think about including them. Think about including nonfiction books that go with them, and audio and movies, and it makes a great display. Hi.
Hi, Joyce. My name's Shirley Franks. I work at Tamworth Library, which is in a regional area. And just looking at the West, we have Westerns obviously quite popular, but we also, along with another genre with that, is what we have here, rural romance. I don't know if you have that genre. It's really popular. It's I guess it's more from the female side of things, but they're not always romance like the Linda Millers,
Right.
but they're certainly set in the country areas on stations or large properties, usually have really strong female characters. There's not necessarily shootouts and that kind of thing, but lots of horses and cattle and that kind of thing. So I just thought I'd let you know that in the regional areas, that's what we find is really popular, actually, is rural romance, and they're generally Australian authors as well, which is really great.
Right. I think that's very interesting. I mean, it's just not, it's been much harder for women authors to break into Westerns in the US. And it's really exciting to see that you have that kind of audience. And I bet that it's not just women readers. I bet you have a lot of men who read them too, because they're good stories.
Yes, it's not just women.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're kind of through the questions, Joyce, but people will have your email address so that they can get in touch and email. Look, I'd really like to thank you for your presentation today, and hopefully people will thank you now so much. It was really,
It was an honor to be here, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm hoping that you'll be posting the rest of the sessions, because I'd like to see, stuff from them. I'd like to see what else happens today.
well, yes, no, hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully we, I'll send you the links.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.